Tonight, coalition cuts cause consternation over their calls to axe free TAFE courses. The Australian Education Union slams the idea. As the opposition campaign continues to falter, a new opinion poll suggests they could receive the lowest vote share since the Liberal Party was founded in the mid-1940s. And in our Friday forum, how important are regional bank branches? With a moratorium on closures to eventually end, what could be the future of some of our regional communities? The Regional Australia Bank is bucking the trend. They're opening branches, but is it sustainable? All that and more tonight on Firstline.
This is Firstline with Daniel Pizarro.
Good evening. How many of you know someone who has gone to TAFE? Hundreds of thousands of people, ranging from those who have just left high school to older people wanting to learn new skills, use the vocational institutes in each state and territory. The federal Labor government has legislated its $1.5 billion free courses scheme, where over 600,000 people have enrolled in eligible courses since January 2023, though just 100,000 people have so far completed their courses. Now this week, a video showing Shadow Education Minister Sarah Henderson saying the free TAFE scheme isn't working has sparked fears for the future of TAFE and those free courses. It comes after the opposition voted against the scheme earlier this year.
That's why we will axe our free TAFE.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton says his government would build 12 new technical colleges at a cost of $260 million. It's a similar idea to the previous John Howard policy, and it does have support within the construction and building sector. But not unsurprisingly, the government and Australian Education Union have slammed the opposition stance, warning axing the free TAFE courses would actually mean fewer builders and push up housing prices. This week, I spoke to AEU President Correna Hathorpe and first asked her what exactly these free courses offer.
Well, Free TAFE was a program that's been implemented by the Albanese government. It really had its genesis from the Jobs and Skills Summit in 2022 when they took a tripartite approach to bring industry, unions and governments together to rebuild the TAFE system. And as a result, they have implemented Free TAFE, and it's now been rolling out across the country, and we've seen over 600,000 enrolments, and it's been life-changing, particularly for students who were unable to access TAFE previously because of the costs associated with doing their courses.
And what are the particular free courses available?
Well, the courses really target areas where we've got skill shortages. So they range from aged care to construction to early childhood education and so on. But from our perspective, what we're hearing from students on the ground is that some of these courses have actually been life-changing. I was with a TAFE teacher last week who received a message from a student who had enrolled in a course and then had picked up an apprenticeship as a result. So that's the on-the-ground evidence of the fact that this is working. We also know that it's helping the TAFE sector rebuild after 9 years of coalition government cuts.
TAFE, of course, is a very important aspect of the Australian education sector because you can have various pathways to a career or learn new skills, whether you're someone just out of high school to a person many years older, and it can even be a pathway to university if you want. The main issue, of course, has been that lack of funding and the availability of certain courses, particularly out here in regional areas. With the free courses that have been on offer, have you seen a real big change in people being able to get employment or to learn those new skills?
Yes, we have. And I think one of the incredible things about TAFE is that it has a social contract to Australia's population. And that contract is about making sure that every student, whether they're a young person leaving school or someone who has lost their job and needs to upskill and retrain, that everyone can have access to high quality vocational education delivered by TAFE, which is the public provider. And so we are seeing not only on the ground the impact of this with students taking up these courses, but of course because we've now got certainty of funding for TAFE itself. TAFE campuses are being revitalised. TAFE teachers are getting converted to permanent and ongoing work, and we've got courses opening up that were closed under the previous coalition government.
There has been this leaked video of the Shadow Education Minister, Sarah Henderson, saying that the current TAFE free courses scheme is just not working, and there has been this discussion of that the coalition will axe the entire scheme. They, of course, voted against the expansion of it earlier this year before the federal election was called. If those free courses were axed, what would be the impact?
Look, the impact on the ground will be devastating, not only for regional communities where we've seen TAFE campuses once again, being revitalised, but the student cohort that's been accessing free TAFE is a cohort that hasn't been able to afford to undertake vocational education training. So we've got priority cohorts such as women who are returning to the workforce or are coming out of family and domestic violence circumstances. We've got Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people taking up these courses. We've got students from regional locations, students with disability, and first generation migrants that are taking up these courses. So from our perspective, this is about access and engagement and supporting people once they undertake a vocational education program of study.
Why do you think the coalition is looking at trying to axe such a scheme?
Well, look, we're gravely concerned about the coalition's plans for TAFE, for free TAFE in particular, but unfortunately it's a pattern that was established many years ago, and they're really reverting to previous form. Under the previous coalition, we had a massive privatisation agenda, and everyone will remember the stories about dodgy private providers with escalating costs for students, dodgy iPads and laptop schemes that were provided if people signed up for a course, and the escalating debts that students had to carry. We're not interested at all in returning to those days. We now have a public system, TAFE, which has been revitalised under the Albanese government's plans. We've got state governments working together with the federal government to ensure that students have access, and that's particularly important for young people and people returning to the work in regional locations, because it was the case that in many regions across the nation, campuses were closed under the previous coalition government's agenda.
As you mentioned, one of the biggest aspects of these free courses has been the building courses for those learning the solid trade. There has been warnings from experts that if this free TAFE scheme was replaced, then not only would we find it incredibly hard to get more builders, in fact, the coalition has actually admitted that they would have to employ more builders through the migration scheme, even though they're saying they're trying to cut down on immigration. But this could also push up the prices of housing. And given we're in a housing crisis and a rental crisis, as well as a skill shortage crisis, this situation could make our entire building sector even more of a problem than what it currently is.
But that's correct, and everyone's talking about the housing crisis at the moment. You can't resolve the housing crisis without tradies, and you can't have tradies without vocational education, and vocational education is delivered in TAFE, and you can't have those courses delivered without TAFE teachers who are supported to do their jobs well. So it is a little ironic that at the very time when Australia needs a highly skilled workforce, that the coalition is planning to cut a program that is actively getting people back into the profession, whether it's the construction industry or aged care or early childhood. So, the on-the-ground impact of that for our members, of course, is that they won't have the necessary resources and funds to do the work that they're doing currently, which is educating the tradies of the future.
I know that, as you mentioned, 600,000 people have signed up to the free courses since it began a couple of years ago. Current figures say that about only 100,000 people have so far completed those courses. What do you think are some of the major factors that is preventing that full completion rate, and what do you think can be done to improve the situation?
Well, there seems to be a little bit of excitement about enrolments versus completions, but the feedback that we've had from our members on the ground in TAFE, who are actually, undertaking the education programs, is that's a very simplistic view. With respect to completions, TAFE, free TAFE was brought in 2023, so we are in the early days of it. We've seen many students who've started a course and found out that it doesn't actually work for them, so they've swapped to another course, and then they become part of that statistic, which is around non-completion. But in actual fact, they've had counselling and support from TAFE teachers, and they're now studying in a course that is more suited to their needs. That is not talked about when you talk about completion rates. The other factor is that many of these courses, of course, are not short courses. They might be 12 months or 3 years in duration, and so we won't actually get a real picture until some time has passed.
Has the coalition explained what they would do as a replacement for axing these free courses? I know particularly for some aspects they will pay business owners to hire apprenticeships, but that in some ways can be a bit of a slippery slope, can it? Because you could have someone who could try and maybe game the system, essentially.
Yes, look, we are very concerned about the coalition's plans, not only the issue in terms of the proposed payments for bosses for apprenticeships, but today they've announced that everything old is new again, and they're going back to the John Howard days of technical colleges. So a $250 million announcement for 12 colleges across Australia. Now, that is not going to resolve the skills crisis. We've got a trusted TAFE system and a network of vocational education that is proven, and that needs to be backed. Like, we don't need these crazy plans of going back to the past and implementing failed programs.
And how have you found, aside from the concerns over the axing of the free TAFE courses, how have you found the other educational policies announced by either Labor or the Coalition or the Greens or other candidates?
Yes, it's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest. What we've seen from Labor has been an extraordinary commitment with respect to school funding and free TAFE, and that's something that we've campaigned for a very, very long time. What we've seen from the Greens is backing public education fully and making sure that free TAFE is valued and supported and that public schools are fully funded. We've also got a number of crossbench senators and independents that have come out and put their claims on the ground with respect to public education. We wrote to Peter Dutton in February and asked for him to provide information to us about his education policy, and we've not had a response. Instead, what we've seen is comments through the media, about slashing free TAFE, cutting free TAFE and getting rid of it, and B, about this crazy notion that teachers are delivering a woke agenda in schools and indoctrinating students, not educating them. So attacks on the Australian curriculum, which is a curriculum that was reviewed, endorsed and implemented by the previous coalition government. But really, it's about creating a negative narrative about the teaching profession, and that is not at all respectful of the work that teachers do in schools every day.
Especially as you've also been fighting a teachers shortage with so many teachers now, particularly in the public school sector, who have been retiring over the past couple of years. I know there was a massive problem trying to get particularly male teachers to get into places like primary schools. High school math teachers was a major issue a couple of years ago, and trying to get people to stay in the public the public education system has been one of your biggest concerns, because if you're having a teacher shortage, that can lead to bigger classes, which can make it even harder for students to learn and for schools to manage the situation.
Yes, that's right. And teacher shortages are not resolved when politicians say terrible things about teachers and the work that they do, because then it seems like it's a less attractive career, particularly for young people leaving school to take up. What we know works is investing in the teaching profession and making sure that they've got the resources that they need to deliver that high quality education that Australia expects for every child. So that's why we've absolutely welcomed the Albanese's government to provide that funding to public education, to public schools. And that's why we're gravely concerned about the lack of clarity from the opposition, and the fact that what they have said publicly is that they're going to tie public school funding to their ideology. So if you don't deliver the curriculum that they want in public schools, then your funding is at risk. And also they've threatened to cut the staffing of the Federal Education Department, which is a very Trump-style attack on the Education Department and on the teaching profession.
Not to mention, of course, the universities themselves are under pressure. And for many years, of course, we've had the various concerns from those who are wanting to go into a tertiary education and to learn a tertiary educational course. HECS debts have been one of the biggest concerns as well. We've had the various initiatives that have been in place. And of course, a lot of these universities work with TAFE and other educational organisations and institutions to provide those pathways for students who might not have done as well in like the HSC and are trying to make the best situation they possibly can. But if they're facing with a situation where they're either not being given the quality education that they deserve, then they could be facing so many more challenges later down in life, and that can have some serious consequences on them.
Look, that's right. And universities have got a critical role to play with respect to the teaching profession, for example, because, of course, they provide the initial teacher education programs that we need to make sure we've got a highly skilled workforce. For young people leaving school, we want to make sure that they've got really proper school counselling services in place that can guide them and help them choose what is the best pathway for them. And that might be going straight into the workforce, or it might be undertaking study, vocational education through TAFE, or it might be going to university. And I think one of the things that parents and our communities value is the fact that in Australia, young people have choices about what they do for their future, and they should be supported whichever pathway they take.
So what are you hoping will be achieved in 2025? I certainly gather from our interview here that you definitely would prefer the Albanese government to be re-elected.
Well, at this point, the Albanese government is the government that has prioritised public education, and we've seen over the last 3 years an incredible commitment. It's really dealt with a lot of the legacy issues that our sector was facing, from early childhood to schools and TAFE. And I think that as people go into this election, they really need to look carefully at the political policies that are on offer. As I've said, the Australian Greens have also got a really good suite of policies that support public education, as do several of the independents and crossbench. But we have a vacuum with respect to the coalition. And, you know, we think the choices are very clear for people, and we're asking people to support public education when they vote.
And finally, Mrs. Hathorpe, what message do you have for those people here in the New England Northwest who are looking at TAFE as a possible employment and educational pathway?
TAFE is a fantastic place to begin your journey with respect to vocational education. It has highly qualified teaching workforce. It has the foundational supports and the social supports that people might need. And we believe that in terms of building the future for Australia, it is TAFE that is the heart of our communities, and it's TAFE that should be supported by all political parties.
Mrs. Hathorpe, thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
As we mark the end of week 3 of the federal election campaign, polling continues to paint dire warnings for the coalition. YouGov released a new opinion poll, which, if replicated, will leave the coalition on its lowest share of the vote since the Liberal Party was created in 1944. Both parties are tied on the primary vote with 33% and the Greens on 13%. And following preferences, Labor has extended its two-party preferred lead to 53%, its strongest lead in 18 months, while the coalition has dropped to 47%. That two-party preferred result is stronger than what Labor got at the 2022 federal election, though whether that would translate into a government retaining a majority is not certain. Labor is leading in all states and territories except for Mr Dutton's home state of Queensland. As preferred Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese remains out in front with 48%, while Peter Dutton is 10 points behind, and has been struggling to gain support in inner and outer metropolitan areas. However, he is just 1 point behind Mr Albanese in terms of popularity in provisional seats and is more popular than the Prime Minister in rural seats, 48 to 37. YouGov says Mr Dutton's poor standing in outer metropolitan seats is one of the key factors in his drop in support, and the Liberals need those seats to get into government. But with just 2 weeks left in the campaign, anything can happen. Your local bank branch can be the financial heart of a community. Everything from business transactions to sponsorships can be made at a branch. But hundreds of regional banks in towns, big and small, have been shuttered over the past few years, causing grave concerns about the future of some of these places. In January, the big four banks agreed to a 2.5-year moratorium on closing regional bank branches, but what could happen after that period ends? Meanwhile, one group who appears to want to fill the void is the Tamworth-based Regional Australia Bank, whose CEO, David Heine, has overseen expansion across regional New South Wales. But are they the saviour for regional communities, or will they eventually have to look at cutting back themselves? Mr Heine, it's great to speak to you. Regional communities have a very close relationship with their banks and their regional bank branches, even more so than a metropolitan area might. But over the past few years, we have seen hundreds of regional bank branches being closed across Australia, and the effects can be quite devastating. How important is a bank branch in a small community in a regional area first?
Well, thank you, Daniel, for having me today, first and foremost, and happy Easter to, what do you call, are they listeners on a podcast? Forgive me, I'm too old.
Well, in this case, it can be listeners and viewers.
All listeners and viewers, I hope you're all having a wonderful Easter weekend. Spending it with family and enjoying being alive in a beautiful part of the world. Excellent question, Daniel. And this is an issue that is very top of mind for myself. And perhaps, as you know, I've joined with 18 other regional bank, mutual bank CEOs to raise awareness of this issue that too many of our large bank cousins have decoupled, in our view, their social commitment to provide face-to-face services to regional Australians in particular. Instead backing the fact that they can continue to make money out of regional Australians and effectively export the profit that they make from that without having to reinvest in branches and staff and infrastructure, particularly around cash, back into regional Australia. And your question is a good one because it goes to asking us to challenge, well, what is it that face-to-face banking gives regional Australians? And is there a difference perhaps in what regional Australians do and need of face-to-face banking that perhaps their city cousins can't and don't achieve? Well, I think far too many people simply say that digital banking, these online and mobile channels is the way of the future and that people don't need to see a human being across a counter anymore. I don't think that's true. I really don't think that that's right. And in fact, I think there are things afoot, Daniel, which mean that that physical point of contact with an intelligent, trained, regulated human being who understands the context of your banking circumstance across a counter is even more valuable today, especially when we are constantly assaulted with the threats of scams and frauds, which are a horrible blight on society. To be able to walk up and speak to someone across a counter who understands your financial situation, has a sense of your natural history of the way you spend your money, the way you invest, the way you create value, and can help you, even without you know it, identify warning signs that you should be made aware of and help educate you in such a way that you can avoid, in many cases, quite tragic outcomes for many people where people are at risk of losing their entire life savings.
Yeah, there can be so many elaborate and sophisticated scams now. You might not even be aware. I know some of the most infamous are those scammers who manage to switch your SIM card around, and you think, oh, your phone's just out of service, but your phone's actually just been hacked. And then soon enough, they start asking for your bank card information, and they're able to access it.
Well, can it happen? There's so many terrible stories, Daniel. I really my heart hurts when I hear of the next story where someone has been exposed to this terrible blight. And in many cases, Daniel, they don't require technology for you to become a victim. Romance scams, etc., are one of the most horrible crimes imaginable in my view, where these people take advantage of, genuinely trusting and needy people, someone who just wants love. And they convince them that they should, as a consequence of this false offer of a relationship with someone, part with so much money that it's horrible to see. And in many cases, the victim is not aware that they're a victim, and certainly until it's far too late. And digital channels don't help you there. You really need to have people help intercept and give you some assurance and help that what you're engaging with them on is real, as opposed to what they're engaging on with the fraudster or the scam artist. It's horrible. But I could talk for hours, Daniel, on the issue of scams and frauds. But it's not limited to that, I think, in terms of the answer to your question. Look, it won't surprise any of your audience to know that telecommunications is nowhere near as confident across regional Australia as it is through the cities. And if you're reliant on mobile connectivity or access to the internet to support your internet banking access, then, in some of our towns and communities, good luck. If you need to make a payment, if you need to be aware of what's in your bank account, etc., and you don't have confident access to these sorts of telecommunication channels, then you need to be able to walk into a branch and find out what's really going on. And sometimes you can't afford to wait till whenever the telco fixes the issue.
Especially as we've just had the 3G permanent shut off, and despite all the big telco campaigns, the government campaigns, the reminders and all that, many people either forgot or didn't realize that their devices, even ATMs, were relying on that old technology, or even machines that they have for their businesses, that if suddenly it stops working for them, they can't do transactions. And the best, even their phones won't even work. So the best thing they can do is rush to their local bank branch. But if they can't do that, if it's either many hours away or they don't have a local bank branch in town, they're stuck for maybe hours or even days.
That's absolutely true, Daniel. And look, I've worked in payments and banking for a long time and spent a long time building different types of electronic payment solutions, etc. At the end of the day, the ultimate fallback when these electronic payment systems don't work is cash and your branch. They're it. They are the ultimate fallback. There's an interesting case study. I think it's Sweden is the economy on the earth which progressed furthest towards eliminating cash within their economy. They were quite effective in replacing cash in circulation with electronic means. But they took a different policy stance a few years ago, where effectively what they did was they implemented a policy where there was a base level of cash required to remain in circulation, where payments of a cash form would always have a place. And essentially their argument, I'm being a bit summary in describing quite a complex debate, but if you cut it down, essentially what Sweden realised was that they were quite exposed as an economy to external interference if all of their payments operated only on electronic forms, and that it wouldn't take much for a bad actor from outside of Sweden to play serious havoc with their economy, just by interfering with those electronic means. And that proves to me that yes, cash and face-to-face banking is important. It has a place. It is the ultimate fallback. It is the thing which you can rely on when those other means don't operate as planned. And as such, and as a bank, I think we have an important social commitment to provide those services, to make sure that our communities have access to that fail-safe form of making payments and exchanging value.
Especially as you would be aware how in 1992, Sweden had that big banking crisis and they had to look really at their big banks, and they they nationalized the bad banks. They defaulted on some payments. But the main thing is they had to make sure that there was money in the ATMs, in the banks, to make sure that people could actually, when they wake up, if they need to go to an ATM and make a cash withdrawal, that there would actually be cash there. And that was the big concern that Ireland had, of course, in 2008. And then they only just did the bank guarantee. They didn't close down the bad banks and all that. And that left their economy in ruins. And that also severely damaged the relationships between the public and the banks themselves.
Yeah, and look, confidence is the word here, isn't it? And we only need to go back in our economy, in our history, back to COVID, when the government carefully demarked industries which they thought were critical, and had a different set of arrangements in terms of what people were allowed to do with respect to work practices, and those were not necessarily critical. And banking, in my view, quite rightly so, was deemed to be a critical service. It is an activity which must continue and must continue with confidence. Both consumers and businesses need to be able to make payments, exchange value, with confidence that their service provider will be there, that the method of payment will be effective and complete, and that if there are any issues that go bang in the night, that they have access to someone who can help solve that issue fast. And again, I think they're all of the reasons why I think that that it's a bank's job to be available to our community, to our retail customers, to our small businesses, to our larger businesses, and to offer access to face-to-face services backed by the ability to transact in cash. These other payments channels and means, etc., are important. I don't want your audience to think for a minute that I think that we should go back to a cash-only economy. That's not what I think is a plausible nor realistic outcome. It's not certainly a policy position that I would support. But we can't ignore that cash and branch services have and do play an important role, especially when things don't work. And that is the space that banks, I think, need to up their game and make sure that we do provide that level of confidence to all consumers. But in my view, especially regional Australians, because of those unique differences we spoke about.
What gets me, of course, is, and there's that cynicism. Many of these big banks make billion-dollar profits every year. They are huge, they're absolutely huge. But then at the same time, in the lead up to this bank closure moratorium, they were closing banks. They were downsizing. They were axing services. It seems very strange that, hang on, how come we are seeing these regional areas being affected? I can understand sometimes it can be a challenge to get more people into banks, especially if they're starting to become more comfortable with the online or phone services. But the fact is, we know that these bank branches are absolutely vital for things, particularly out here, agribusiness, those more sophisticated and complex transactions or business plans that require a face-to-face meeting with a person, not over the phone.
Yeah, that's true. It is true. Look, I'm lucky. I work for a bank that has a different basis for its purpose and operation, and perhaps I'd like to talk to you a bit more about that today, Daniel. But for most listed organisations, let me focus on the major banks. They're commercially trying to make as much money as they can for their shareholders. And they're looking at perhaps the greatest form of competition for them. And in many cases, that's the overseas banks walking into this marketplace. And those overseas banks don't carry the cost base of expensive branch infrastructure. And so the major banks are looking at those guys saying, well, that's a far more cost-efficient method to make money to return to my shareholders. And so it's pretty obvious, right? I mean, this is not necessarily rocket science, and nor should we be shocked by then the reaction of the major banks to try and replicate the business model of those offshore banks, the INGs and even the Macquarie banks of the world, who run no branches. They're trying to reduce their cost base, reduce the number of people that they employ, the real estate that that they have to pay rents or own, and equally the cost of cash in transit is not an inconsequential part of the cost base of running a retail branch physical network. So these major banks have recognised that they can still write the loans, but not incur the costs. They've been able to decouple the expensive part of banking from the rich part of banking. And I get it. If your job is to maximise shareholder returns, then that's exactly what they do, right? But I think it's unfortunate, and I think it's more than unfortunate. I think it's quite tragic in that I believe that banks do have a social contract with our retail and small business customers. And as I say, that social contract says that you've got to earn the right to engage in profitable business, and that's really the lending part of the book. So you've got to earn the right to be able to lend to those people, to those individuals and small businesses, by first and foremost making sure that you're committed to the expensive part of banking. And that, in my view, is providing face-to-face banking services, branch services.
Explaining briefly, Mr. Heine, how does the Regional Australia Bank actually operate? Because you are a regional bank network based here in the New England Northwest, and are you a mutual or a cooperative? How is your modus operandi?
Yeah, mutual cooperative, essentially the same thing. I mean, there are different forms of cooperatives, but the bit that is common to our structure and other co-ops is that we're owned by our customers, so that we have no separate shareholders. That then I have a job as the CEO of the bank to return dividends to. So the dividend that we create, we are importantly not a charity. We are for profit, but the difference is with what we do with that profit. The profit that is made by a mutual bank like Regional Australia Bank is ultimately reinvested into the business in favour of our owners, of our customers. So that goes towards improved customer service, the ability to continue to operate expensive branches, etc. It goes into lifting our capital base so we can lend more money to more people, etc. But it certainly doesn't get siphoned off in the form of dividends to people who have no other interest in the business whatsoever, other than being a customer member of the organisation. And that, Daniel, really allows me to do one thing which I think is under-recognised and undervalued. And I know my commercial peers are going to scoff at what I'm about to say, but I truly believe that this is an important difference. Most organisations, I'll leave it at banks, most banks have a purpose statement. But in my opinion, for most shareholder level driven organisations or banks, the purpose statement is really nothing more than a statement of your target market. Which group of people, in what form are you going to try and exploit them for the benefit of returning dividends to your shareholders? It sits below the profit maximisation objective. For a mutual bank, it works the other way around, and certainly for Regional Australia Bank, it works the other way around. Our purpose statement, which is really about making sure that the regional communities in which we are part of thrive, they grow, they lift their economies, they take advantage of their innovative competencies and become what they can be. That's our purpose, and that does not sit above the intent to make shareholder returns for dividends returns for shareholders. We are for profit, but only in that it is our job to be more sustainable, to be able to create more opportunity within those regional communities, not to siphon that money off and send it off to a shareholder based in Mosman, Sydney.
That sustainability is very important. With my next question is, you have established this network, you've recently merged with another bank. How are you able to look at that long-term forecast of continuing with some of this expansion, as well as, of course, being financially sustainable? Because down the track, there could be that time when you would have to make that very hard decision. You might have to shut down bank branches because either people aren't coming in, or regardless of what you've been doing, it might be too expensive to operate, or as a certain business might be shutting down in town and you lose a lot of your transactions there. There could be that time when you will have to face that decision on a more personal, local level. about shutting down a regional bank branch?
There are two important reasons why I think we can manage this tension successfully, and it underpins why at the moment Regional Australia Bank is doing the opposite of many of our larger bank peers. We're opening branches, not closing them. And we're about to go live with another new one in Wellington in the next couple of weeks, which I'm very excited about. There's two reasons, and the first relates to the answer that I just shared with you a minute ago, that the profit that we make from our business is designed and intended to be reinvested back into the business to allow ourselves the opportunity to continue to do or to perform commercial activity at a level that perhaps isn't what might be required by a larger shareholder bank. So our thresholds, if you like that, in terms of our business cases for a branch are necessarily lower, and they're designed to see value in anything that fits our purpose. So I think there's fundamentally a difference in terms of our ability to be sustainable that comes from being a mutual. I think that's critically important. But the second one, Daniel, is why I think this is an important discussion for your audience and for the banking market more generally to get our heads around. And that is that, yes, it is tough when we do see a small business come and use our branch and bank the cash takings over the branch, and then within half an hour they've gotten home, hopped online and shifted that money over to their Macquarie cash management account, and where Macquarie make the money out of that banking relationship, and we just simply have expense. That is hard, Daniel, and that does happen, and that makes the challenge of keeping and expanding a branch network difficult. But the more that I talk about this social contract and our intent, our willingness, our drive to honour that social commitment, the more people start to recognise that is important too. And the more, Daniel, we do see our customers, our members react to that. And instead of shifting that money off to Macquarie Bank, they're staying more with us, and that's a good thing. We need more of that, absolutely. And in the absence of more of that, we definitely need a public policy approach. And I still think that it's fundamentally unfair that the big banks can get away without that social commitment. So we do need public policy intervention. But the more, through you and your audience, Daniel, we get to talk to our members and get them to see that what we are doing is the right thing in terms of that social contract with the banking community, I think that the more our customers reward us with their business.
Mr. David Heine, thank you so much for joining me here on Firstline.
Not at all. It was a lot of fun. Thank you very much for having me, Daniel.
And finally, things got heated on the ABC 7:30 program last night between Housing Minister Claire O'Neil and her opposition counterpart, Michael Sukkar. Both were debating which party would construct more affordable homes, especially for homeless women, with presenter Sarah Ferguson frustrated with Mr. Sukkar for not providing numbers on how many homes a coalition government would build.
Sorry, Sarah, I'll get my chance, but I'll correct the record on that.
I'm going to ask you one more time, and everyone is listening to me ask this question. Sure. How many social and affordable houses will you build?
Well, we will fund social and affordable
All right,
housing.
that's it. You're not answering.
Not getting an answer. You'll get an answer out of me. We've got an acute shortage of housing around our country, but particularly in the social and affordable housing space. For those of you at home who are wondering why there is growing homelessness around your suburb and your town, why we have an acute problem with women not being able to leave violent relationships, why we have an extraordinary issue with older women being our biggest growing group going into homelessness, all this comes back to an acute undersupply of social and affordable homes. Now, our government has come into office. We are building 55,000 social and affordable homes over 5 years. 28,000 of those homes, Michael.
What would your mother say, hearing you interrupt her?
I've been interrupted the entire time, Sarah.
Just please.
It's okay. I'm unflappable, Sarah. I've done this my third run at this week.
I certainly know what my mother would say. That's the program for this week. I'm Daniel Pizarro. Thank you so much for your company. Have a great Easter, and I'll see you again next Friday as this election campaign continues. Bye for now.